The
The
gates won't
vampire
hold
king
much longer.
receives a hug by mistake from a
Promise
human
me you'll
girl
take the books
and
and ride
instantly
north
fell
if
in
we are
love.
separated.
Lamps flickered along the cobblestone roads, but their light seemed weak against the shadowed grandeur of the palace at the heart of the city. Few dared approach it, for it was whispered that the vampire king himself ruled from within its blackened walls, and no mortal had ever returned unchanged from his presence. Yet Ilara, a young woman with hair the color of autumn leaves, moved cautiously through the mist. Her village had been stricken by a strange sickness, one that left people pale and listless. Elders spoke of a being in Noctara who held power over life and death, a figure of darkness yet capable of miracles. Desperation had guided her steps to this forbidden place. The gates of the palace loomed before her, towering and cold as if daring her to turn back. But she pressed forward. Her heart raced, not from fear alone, but from a strange sense of destiny that pulled her closer. She barely noticed the statues that seemed to watch her with stone eyes, nor the shadows that moved as though alive along the palace walls. Inside, the palace was a labyrinth of hallways lined with cold marble. The scent of incense and something more ancient hung in the air, stirring a shiver along her spine. Every echo of her footsteps seemed amplified in the vast emptiness. She knew she was intruding, yet she could not stop herself. Something told her that beyond these walls lay the answer to her village's suffering. It was in the central hall, under the gaze of chandeliers that glowed with an unnatural pale light, that she saw him. Kale, the vampire king, stood as if carved from shadows and moonlight. His dark hair fell like silk around a pale face, and his eyes, sharp and deep, seemed to pierce straight into her soul. He did not move at first. He simply observed, silent and commanding. Ilara froze. She had expected a monster, yet before her was a man of terrifying beauty, and something about him made her pulse quicken. She thought he looked lonely, standing there among the silent walls, and in a moment of unthinking courage, or perhaps foolishness, she stepped forward. I am sorry for coming here, she said, her voice trembling but steady. I only seek help. Kale's lips moved in the faintest curve of a smile, though his eyes remained unreadable. And what help do you seek, little one? He asked, his voice smooth like flowing water over stones. It was neither cruel nor kind, only commanding. I need someone who can save my village, she stammered. They are sick, and no healer can help them, please. Kale tilted his head slightly, studying her. He could feel the raw life force radiating from her, warm and fragile, unlike the endless night he had known for centuries. There was something about her honesty, her courage in stepping so boldly into danger, that stirred something long buried within him. Before he could answer, Ilara, driven by a mixture of gratitude and fear, stepped forward and did the only thing she could think of. She wrapped her arms around him in a quick, instinctive hug. The moment her warmth touched him, Kale's world shifted. He had not felt the presence of another so intimately for hundreds of years. The sensation was overwhelming, sudden, and frightening. His instincts screamed to pull away, yet a strange, unnameable longing held him in place. Ilara pulled back almost immediately, eyes wide with realization. I am sorry, she whispered. I did not mean to, but Kale only watched her, his usual composure faltering. The chill that surrounded him seemed to waver in her presence, as if her warmth had pushed it back for a moment. He felt the stirring of emotions that were forbidden, dangerous even, yet undeniably irresistible. You are bold, he said at last, his voice low, almost reverent. Few dare touch me, even by accident. Ilara's cheeks flushed crimson. She had imagined monsters, yet she had never thought they would inspire or rather than fear. I only wanted to show thanks, she said softly. I did not know it would, she trailed off, realizing she might have offended the most powerful being in the city. Kale's eyes, sharp and deep, softened just slightly. Gratitude is rare, he murmured. Even rarer when it is unspoken. He paused, studying her more closely, noticing the faint scars on her hands from hard work, The way her eyes glimmered with hope despite exhaustion, the fragile courage that carried her into his domain. The court had begun to stir. Shadows moved at the edges of the hall, servants and attendants whispering among themselves. News of the human in the palace and her audacious hug would spread like wildfire. Kale sensed it already. Rumors would grow, suspicion would rise, and his enemies would see this as weakness. Yet at this moment all of that seemed distant. Alara took a hesitant step backward, her heart pounding. "I should go," she whispered. "I did not mean to cause trouble." Kale lifted a hand, stopping her. "No, you do not leave, not yet." His voice carried authority, but beneath it was something softer, something curious. He had spent centuries isolating himself, ruling with distance and fear, yet here was a human who had touched him in a way he had not anticipated. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other, the silence filled with unspoken questions and fragile understanding. Then Kale spoke, his tone a mixture of command and intrigue. "Stay, tell me everything about your village, the sickness, the lives at risk. Perhaps there is more to this than simple misfortune." Alara nodded, relief flooding her. She had expected anger or punishment, yet he asked her to speak. Carefully, she began to describe her village, the people she loved, and the strange illness that had struck them. Kale listened, his eyes never leaving hers, absorbing each word. In his long, dark life, he had seen countless tragedies, but there was a rawness in her voice, a human fear that resonated with something he had forgotten he could feel. As she spoke, Kale's mind wandered to the centuries he had spent in isolation. He thought of the countless humans he had ruled from a distance, the lives he had influenced and controlled, and yet never truly known. How strange it was, he realized, that one accidental embrace could stir something so profound, so human, inside him. Alara noticed the subtle changes in him, the softening of his gaze, the hesitation in his movements. She could sense the weight he carried, the centuries of solitude, the burden of power. And in a small, quiet way, she felt a connection to him, fragile but undeniable. The conversation lasted hours, though neither noticed the passage of time. Shadows grew longer, the chandeliers dimmed, and the chill of night seeped into the corners of the hall. Kale, who had always avoided human attachment, felt the pull of something unfamiliar, empathy, concern, and a dawning curiosity that he could not name. Finally, when her voice grew tired and her eyes heavy, Kale spoke again. "You will rest here tonight. It is not safe for you to leave the palace in the dark." His words were firm, yet there was a gentleness beneath them that surprised even him. Alara hesitated, aware of the danger she was in, yet trusting him, at least in part. "Thank you," she whispered. She could feel the faint warmth of his presence still lingering, a contrast to the cold shadows of the palace. As she was led to a guest chamber, Kale remained in the central hall, watching the door close behind her. The faint echo of her steps lingered in the vast emptiness, and he found himself listening, unconsciously hoping for the sound to return. The night stretched on, silent but for the whisper of the wind against the palace walls. Kale stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The moonlight painted the world in silver and shadow, but it was not the city that held his attention. It was her. A single human girl who had dared to touch him, who had unknowingly awakened something he thought he had lost forever. And in that quiet, endless night, Kale realized that he would not forget her. Not the way she had looked at him, not the way her small, bold gesture had shattered his centuries of solitude. She had entered his life by accident, yet he could feel already that her presence would linger far longer than he could have imagined. Outside, the wind whispered through the towers of Noctara, carrying the scent of rain and the distant memory of autumn leaves. Within the palace, Kale's heart, long thought frozen, began to stir, trembling with an emotion he neither welcomed nor fully understood. And somewhere in the darkness, a question took root, one that would not let him rest. Who is this human, and why has she touched my soul so deeply? The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer. The morning light was pale as it filtered through the tall windows of the palace, yet it brought no warmth to the vast halls. Kale moved silently through the corridors, his thoughts heavy and tangled. Even after the night's events, he could not rid himself of the memory of her touch. Ilara, the human girl who had dared to hug him, lingered in his mind like a spark in darkness. He found himself returning to the central hall, the place where she had made her mistake, or perhaps fate had guided her. The space was empty now, but he could feel her presence lingering, as if she had left traces of herself in the very air. For centuries, Kale had been untouchable, unshaken by the fleeting affections of humans. Yet she had awakened something he had long believed was dead: curiosity, warmth, and a dangerous longing. Meanwhile, Ilara awoke in the guest chamber, sunlight streaming through the tall window. The room was unfamiliar, yet surprisingly comforting. She had slept lightly, aware of the palace's silent gaze, and the memories of last night's encounter with the vampire king lingered in her mind. She was not afraid, though she understood the danger of being in his presence. She felt a mixture of fear and fascination: fear of the unknown, fascination with the man who had stirred something in her heart she did not yet understand. As she rose and moved to the window, she could see the mist curling over the city below. Noctara seemed alive and secretive, each shadow hiding untold stories. Her mind turned to her village, the sickness that had brought her here, and the man who might hold their salvation. A knot of determination formed in her chest. She had come seeking help, and she would not leave until she found it. Kale did not summon her immediately. Instead, he observed her from the shadows, watching the way she moved through the room with quiet grace. He could not explain why, but he felt compelled to learn more about her. Humans were fleeting, fragile, and often disappointing. Yet Ilara was different. Her courage, her honesty, her willingness to face danger with no thought for herself, all of it fascinated him. Finally, he appeared at her door, silent as a shadow. Ilara turned at the sound of his presence, and the air between them seemed to tighten. Kale's dark eyes met hers, sharp and unyielding, yet there was a trace of something softer beneath the surface. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and measured. "I trust you slept," Ilara nodded, finding her voice despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest. "Yes, thank you." Kale stepped inside, moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. "You must understand," he said, "that your presence here is dangerous. Many would see you as a tool or worse, a threat. Why should I trust you?" Ilara took a steadying breath. "I do not ask for trust, only for your help. My village is sick and I have nowhere else to turn." Her eyes held his, unwavering, and for a moment Kale felt the weight of her courage press against the walls he had built around himself. "Few humans are so bold," he murmured, almost to himself. "Boldness is often rewarded with pain." Ilara tilted her head, a small spark of defiance in her gaze. "I would rather face pain than watch my people suffer." Kale studied her, the tension in the room thick like the fog outside. He felt a strange pull toward her, not desire as he had known it in the past, but something deeper, more complicated. She had entered his life without invitation, yet he found himself unwilling to let her go. Over the next hours they spoke at length. Ilara told him of the sickness, of the hopelessness that had settled over her village like a dark cloud. Kale listened carefully, his sharp mind analyzing every detail. He was aware of the fragility of humans, yet he could not deny the fire in her words, the light in her presence that seemed to push back the centuries of darkness he carried within him. As they spoke, Kale allowed himself to reveal fragments of his past, not the full truth, for that was too dangerous, but enough to let her glimpse the burden of his immortality. He spoke of centuries spent in isolation, of battles fought and kingdoms ruled, of losses that had left his heart encased in ice. He expected her to recoil, to judge him as cruel or cold. But Ilara listened with empathy, her eyes soft and understanding. "You have carried much," she said quietly, "and yet you still care. That is why you are feared. People cannot believe that power can coexist with compassion." Kale did not answer immediately. Her words touched something deep within him, a part he had long forgotten. He had ruled with fear, yes, but he had also ruled with a sense of duty, a duty to protect, to maintain balance. And in Alara's gaze, he saw recognition of that truth. Time passed unnoticed. The light in the room shifted from pale morning to golden noon. Kale found himself drawn closer to her presence, the boundaries of his usual restraint weakening. He spoke less of command and more of curiosity, asking questions about her life, her fears, her dreams. Alara responded in kind, finding herself drawn to the enigmatic king despite the danger. Yet with every passing moment, Kale felt the danger of his own emotions. Humans were fleeting, and attachment could be fatal. One wrong step, one lapse in control, could destroy them both. He had lived long enough to know the consequences of indulgence, yet he could not stop the growing fascination, the pull toward her that defied logic and caution. The afternoon brought a moment of silence. Kale stood by the window, watching the mist swirl around the towers, while Alara remained seated, lost in thought. He turned to her, the shadows of his face softening in the fading light. "There is much you do not understand about this world," he said quietly. "And yet you step into it without fear. That is rare and dangerous, but also compelling." Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. "I do not understand everything," she admitted, "but I know that fear cannot guide me. If I do nothing, my people will suffer." Kale felt a pang of something unfamiliar, admiration mixed with sorrow. Her bravery was unshakable, and yet he knew the weight of mortality pressed heavily upon her. A single mistake, a single misstep could end her life. And still, she faced the unknown with open eyes. "Come closer," he said, almost reluctantly, aware of the tension in his own chest. "There is something you must see." He led her to a part of the palace few humans had ever entered, a library filled with ancient tomes, their pages heavy with dust and secrets. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and candle wax. Kale moved with purpose to a shelf, pulling down a book bound in black leather. "This contains knowledge of life and death," he explained. "Of sickness, of healing, of forces that most mortals cannot comprehend. Perhaps it holds what you seek." Alara approached, her fingers brushing the edges of the book. She could feel the weight of centuries in its pages, yet she also felt the weight of Kale's presence beside her. It was intoxicating and frightening, the way his shadow seemed to blend with hers, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. "Can this help my village?" she asked softly. Kale hesitated. "It might, but such knowledge is dangerous. Misuse could bring ruin to more than your village. You must understand the responsibility it carries." Alara nodded. "I will not misuse it. I only seek to save lives." Kale studied her, sensing the truth in her words. There was a purity to her intent that he had not expected in centuries of dealing with humans. And yet, he knew that the danger of attachment was real. One wrong step, one lapse in judgment, and she could be destroyed by forces beyond her understanding. As they pored over the ancient text, the afternoon shadows grew longer, stretching across the library floor. Kale felt a tension in the air, not of threat, but of unspoken connection. The brush of her hand against the page, the tilt of her head as she read, the quiet determination in her voice, all of it wove a spell around him that he could not break. And yet he resisted. He had ruled for centuries with control and precision, and he would not let himself be undone by fleeting human warmth. Still, every glance, every small gesture, drew him closer to a truth he had long denied, that even a creature of darkness could feel longing, could crave companionship, could desire something he had thought forever beyond reach. The hours slipped by, unnoticed, until the first candles were lit in the high windows, casting flickering shadows across the room. Kale closed the book and regarded Alara, the quiet moment heavy with meaning. "You are unlike any human I have met," he said finally. "Bold, compassionate, reckless, yet wise in ways you cannot yet understand." Alara met his gaze unflinching. "I only do what I must. Courage is not a gift, it is a choice." Kale allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Then perhaps we are not so different after all." As the night crept closer, the palace seemed to grow quieter, the shadows longer and more intimate. Kale knew he would not let her leave just yet. There was more to learn, more to understand, more to risk. And despite the danger, he found himself wishing that the human girl who had dared to touch his heart might stay, if only for a while. And in that silence, a single thought took root in Kale's mind, persistent and undeniable. "She is not just a visitor in my life. She is the beginning of something I cannot yet name, and I do not know if I can resist it." The night settled over Noctara, still and watchful. Within the palace, two souls, one immortal, one fragile and human, stood on the brink of a bond that could change the course of both their lives. And somewhere in the dark corridors, fate whispered its approval, knowing that the story had only just begun. Night had fallen over Noctara, and the palace loomed like a silent sentinel beneath the pale moonlight. Kale walked through the halls with measured steps, the weight of centuries pressing against his shoulders. Something had shifted in the past days, something unnameable, dangerous, and yet stirring. Alara's presence had entered his life like a spark in darkness, igniting emotions he had long buried beneath centuries of control. Alara, meanwhile, had grown more comfortable in the palace, though comfort was a delicate thing in Kale's world. The library had become a place of learning and quiet conversation. Each day, she absorbed the knowledge of the ancient texts, seeking anything that could help her village. Yet she also sensed the invisible walls Kale had erected around himself, walls built from sorrow, power, and centuries of solitude. She longed to see beyond them, to touch the man beneath the legend of the Vampire King. The quiet of the palace was not to last. Whispers had begun to drift through the corridors, carried by shadows and servants' fears. A rival faction of vampires, jealous of Kale's reign and fearful of his growing attachment to a human, plotted in secret. They saw Alara as a weakness, a crack in Kale's armor that could be exploited. The thought of her in danger made Kale's chest tighten, a feeling he had not expected. The centuries had taught him control, yet his emotions now threatened to betray him. He found Alara in the library that evening, seated at a table strewn with scrolls and ancient tomes. Her hair fell across her face, golden in the candlelight, and she looked both fragile and determined. Kale studied her for a moment, the shadows of the room painting his features with dark intensity. "You spend too much time here," he said softly, not as a command but as a concern. "You will tire yourself." Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. "I must learn," she said firmly. "If I am to help my village, I cannot waste time. Every hour counts." Kale's dark eyes lingered on her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the quiet bravery in her stance. He wanted to shield her from the dangers she did not yet understand, yet he knew that protecting her entirely would take away the very fire that drew him to her. Humans were fleeting, fragile, yet in their courage, there was a kind of strength he had not felt in centuries. "You risk much in your quest for knowledge," he said, his tone measured. "Do you understand the dangers?" "I understand more than you think," Alara replied, her voice calm despite the faint tremor in her hands. "I am not afraid of knowledge, nor of what it may demand. I am only afraid of failing those I love." Kale felt a pang of something he could not name. Admiration, yes, but also sorrow. He had lost so many centuries ago, and in his long life he had rarely encountered a human willing to face fear with such honesty. Her courage was a mirror, reflecting the man he had once been before power and isolation had hardened his heart. As the night deepened, Kale moved closer, watching her study a delicate script in a scroll. The candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where danger did not press so close, where mortality did not threaten at every turn. But the reality of his world intruded, reminding him that attachment could be deadly. The sound of movement from the far end of the library made him tense. Shadows shifted unnaturally, a warning that danger was near. Cale's senses sharpened, his centuries of vigilance kicking in. He did not need to speak, Alara sensed it as well. Her hand moved instinctively to the edge of the table, ready to pull herself back if necessary. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, one of the rival vampires, a creature of cunning and malice. His eyes glinted with envy and hunger, and he carried the faint aura of deadly intent. Cale's presence immediately became a shield, the tension in the room thick and electric. "You have grown careless, Cale," the intruder hissed. "You surround yourself with weakness. A human girl at your side. What are you thinking?" Cale's voice was low, controlled, and sharp. "She is not weak," he said, his dark eyes locking onto the intruder's, "and she is not to be harmed." The vampire's sneer deepened, and the room seemed to darken with the weight of the unspoken threat. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine, yet she stood her ground. She could sense Cale's control, the invisible barrier he placed between her and danger, but she also felt the underlying tension. The stakes were higher than she had realized. Cale moved swiftly, a shadow among shadows. The intruder lunged, but Cale's centuries of experience allowed him to deflect with minimal effort, using movement and presence rather than brute force. The clash was silent but charged with energy, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Alara's heart pounded, but she did not retreat. Instead, she found herself studying the situation, noticing the subtle shifts in Cale's stance, the calm calculation in his movements. She realized that he was not merely powerful, he was disciplined, focused, and precise. And yet, beneath the strength, there was a vulnerability he did not openly show. In a final, swift motion, Cale sent the intruder retreating into the shadows, a warning in his eyes that no further threat would be tolerated. The library fell silent except for the faint crackle of the candle flames. Cale turned to Alara, noting the mixture of fear and admiration in her gaze. "You must understand," he said quietly, "that your courage is a gift, but it can also draw danger. You cannot face the world unprepared." Alara nodded, her resolve firm. "I do not fear learning to face danger," she said. "I only fear failing those I love." Cale allowed himself a long, measured breath. He could see the truth in her words, the same truth that had drawn him to her since the first accidental embrace. In that moment, he made a choice, not to shield her from life entirely, but to guide her through it, to allow her courage to shine while tempering the risks. The days that followed were a careful balance. Cale trained her in knowledge of the supernatural, teaching her about ancient wards, protective spells, and the hidden histories of Noctara. Alara absorbed every lesson with a fierce dedication, her determination unwavering even when the material was complex or dangerous. Yet their interactions were not limited to instruction. There were moments of quiet reflection, where they spoke of life, loss, and the weight of responsibility. Cale found himself revealing fragments of his long existence, tales of kings and queens, of battles and betrayals, of friendships lost to time. Alara listened with empathy, and her questions were thoughtful, never intrusive. "You have carried this burden for centuries," she said one evening as they overlooked the city from a high balcony. "And yet, you have not allowed it to destroy you. How do you endure?" Cale's gaze swept over the city, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Endurance is a choice," he replied. "One must decide whether to allow the darkness to consume them, or to find a way to carry it without letting it define them." Alara's hand brushed against the railing, her mind turning over his words. She could feel the weight of his experience, the depth of his sorrow, and yet she also sensed a glimmer of hope in the way he spoke, a hope he had long denied himself. As the night deepened, Cale returned to the library, only to find a subtle change in the air. He sensed it first, a disturbance in the shadows, a whisper of malice that had been absent before. The rival faction was moving, plotting, and their reach extended closer than he had anticipated. He found Alara still reading, unaware of the danger, her concentration absolute. Cale's heart tightened at the thought of her in peril. He moved to stand beside her, placing a protective hand near hers, not touching but signaling his presence, his vigilance. "You must be careful," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. "The world is not as forgiving as you imagine." Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. "I am not afraid," she said, her voice steady. "Not with you here." Cale's chest tightened at her words. He had spent centuries alone, believing that attachment was a weakness, that love was a vulnerability. Yet here was a human girl, fragile and mortal, offering him trust and courage in equal measure. And he knew that the bond forming between them was stronger than either of them yet realized. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed through the halls, a warning that someone approached. Cale's senses flared and he moved instinctively, placing himself between Alara and the unknown threat. Shadows shifted in the corridor outside the library, and he could sense the intent of those who sought to strike. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice low but firm. "Do not step away." Alara obeyed, her heart pounding, yet she did not falter. She had come to trust him not blindly, but because she believed in the strength behind his protection. And in that trust, Cale felt the stirrings of something powerful. The realization that even he, immortal and unyielding, could be redeemed through connection, through courage, through the human heart beside him. The night stretched on, tense and uncertain, and Cale knew that the true test of their bond had only just begun. Shadows would move, enemies would strike, and the path ahead would be perilous. Yet for the first time in centuries, he felt a flicker of hope, a hope that even in darkness, redemption, courage, and perhaps love could flourish. And as the moonlight bathed the library in silver, Cale realized that he would do whatever was necessary to protect her, even if it meant facing the shadows of his own past. The first threads of danger had been felt. The story of Cale and Alara was no longer merely a tale of accidental embrace. It was now a journey of trust, courage, and the delicate dance between darkness and light. And in that fragile balance, the heart of the Vampire King beat with a rhythm long thought lost to time. The palace of Noctara lay in an uneasy silence. Moonlight spilled across the high towers, illuminating the cold stone and casting long, silver shadows. Within its walls, Cale stood vigilant, senses sharp, heart tense. He had known danger before, of course, but tonight it felt different, closer, personal. The rival faction that had been lurking in the shadows for weeks was now bold enough to strike directly, and the target of their schemes was not just the Vampire King, but the human girl who had touched his heart. Alara moved beside him, her steps steady despite the tension in the air. She had been prepared for this night, training under Cale's careful guidance, learning to navigate a world she had once thought impossible to survive. Yet even with knowledge and courage, she could feel the danger pressing closer, wrapping itself around the palace like a living thing. Cale turned to her, the moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face. "Stay close to me," he instructed, his voice low but firm. "Do not stray from my side." Alara met his gaze, her eyes reflecting both determination and trust. "I am not afraid," she said softly, "not with you here." Cale's chest tightened at her words. Centuries of solitude had taught him that attachment was weakness, that love was vulnerability. Yet here she was, immortal, fragile, courageous, and in her presence he felt something he had long denied himself: hope. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the halls, a faint, unnatural whisper that carried malice. Cale's eyes narrowed, and he moved instinctively, leading Alara through shadowed corridors with the precision of centuries of experience. The rival faction had infiltrated deeper than he had anticipated. As they rounded a corner, figures emerged from the darkness, vampires twisted by envy and ambition, their eyes gleaming with hostility. Kale stepped forward, a protective barrier between Alara and the threat. "You will harm no one here," he said, his voice low, commanding, carrying the authority of a king who had ruled centuries. The attackers hesitated, sensing the power radiating from him. Yet they were determined, believing they could strike at the heart of his growing attachment and weaken him. Kale's senses flared. He could feel their intent, the malice in their shadows, the hunger for power that had driven them to this moment. Alara's hand brushed against Kale's as they moved through the hall, not in fear but as a subtle gesture of connection. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it carried a weight neither of them could deny. Kale's chest tightened, a reminder of the emotions she had awakened in him, emotions he could not afford to ignore, even in the midst of danger. The first strike came swiftly, a figure lunging with speed and precision. Kale deflected with controlled force, his centuries of skill evident in every movement. Shadows and light danced across the walls, flickering with the energy of conflict. Alara watched closely, her training and understanding of the supernatural guiding her instincts. She was not passive, though she knew her strength was still limited compared to the immortal attackers. Kale moved with fluid precision, deflecting attacks, striking where necessary, and always keeping Alara within his protective circle. His mind was a careful balance of calculation and instinct, every decision made with the goal of survival and protection. Yet even amidst the chaos, he found moments where his eyes sought hers, checking, ensuring she remained unharmed. "You must trust me," he whispered during a brief lull, his voice almost lost amidst the clash of shadows. "Do not step away." Alara nodded, feeling the weight of his presence as both shield and anchor. "I trust you," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered beneath the surface. The fight escalated, the rival vampires relentless in their assault. Kale realized that brute force alone would not suffice. Strategy, cunning, and control of the environment were key. He led the attackers through narrow corridors, over staircases, and into the open halls where the moonlight illuminated every shadow, using the palace itself as a weapon. Alara, though human, played her part. She used knowledge gleaned from Kale's lessons, warding symbols, subtle spells, and the careful manipulation of light and shadow to disrupt the attacker's rhythm. Her courage and intelligence impressed Kale more than he could admit, and he felt a swell of pride and admiration he had never expected. As the final attacker fell back, defeated, Kale turned to Alara. "You were remarkable," he said, his voice tinged with something more than command, something almost tender. Alara met his gaze, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "We are stronger together," she said softly. Kale's chest tightened at the words. He had ruled for centuries, believing that isolation was strength and attachment was weakness. Yet here she was, teaching him a lesson he had long forgotten, that trust, courage, and connection were powerful weapons in themselves. The night's danger had passed, but Kale knew it was only the beginning. The rival faction would regroup, and threats would continue to emerge. Yet in this moment, with Alara by his side, he felt something he had not felt in centuries: hope, tempered by vigilance, and a determination to protect the light she brought into his life. As they moved to the palace balcony, the moonlight bathed them in silver. The city below was quiet, the mist curling around the towers like fingers of shadow. Kale turned to her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You are not like any human I have known," he said quietly. "Your courage, your heart, it is extraordinary." Alara reached out, placing her hand lightly on his. The contact was simple yet profound. "And you are not like any immortal I have known," she replied softly. Beneath the shadows there is strength, and beneath the strength there is something more. Something worth believing in. Kale felt a shiver run through him at her words. For centuries, he had been a ruler of fear and shadow, a master of control. Yet here in the quiet of the balcony, he realized that he was capable of something else, something he had long denied himself. Love, connection, redemption. "You have changed me," he admitted, his voice low, almost reverent. "I do not yet understand it fully, but I know that I cannot let it fade." Alara's eyes met his, unwavering. "Change is not weakness," she said. "It is courage, and courage can overcome even the darkest shadows." The night seemed to hold its breath, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain and autumn leaves. Kale and Alara stood together, hand in hand, the distance of centuries and mortality stretching between them, yet bridged by trust and courage. In that quiet moment, Kale made a choice that would define both their lives. He would not allow fear, power, or past mistakes to dictate their future. He would protect her, guide her, and share his life with her, even knowing the dangers that still lingered. The palace remained silent, yet the sense of peril was not gone. Kale knew the rival faction would strike again, that shadows would always threaten those who dared to defy the darkness. Yet he felt ready, fortified by the human girl who had entered his life by accident and awakened something he thought long dead. As the night deepened, they returned to the library, a place of learning, reflection, and now, shared connection. The ancient tomes no longer seemed intimidating or distant. They were symbols of their shared journey, the knowledge of the past guiding the choices of the present. Kale watched Alara, noting how she moved with confidence, how her eyes shone with determination and trust. He realized that she had become more than a visitor in his life. She was a partner, a companion, a source of light in centuries of darkness. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we continue our work. There is still much to learn, much to protect, and much to prepare. The world outside these walls is unforgiving, and we must be ready." Alara nodded, her hand brushing against his once more. "Together," she said simply. Kale allowed himself a faint smile, a rare warmth that had not graced his lips for centuries. "Together," he echoed, the word carrying weight and promise. The night stretched on, quiet and still. Outside, Noctara lay under the watchful eyes of the moon and stars, unaware that within the palace a bond had formed that could change the course of history. Kale and Alara, immortal and mortal, shadow and light, stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. And as they looked out over the city, Kale felt the stirrings of something profound, a realization that even in the darkest nights, hope could shine, courage could endure, and love could be the most powerful force of all. The palace was silent, but within it, a story had reached its first true resolution. A story of trust, courage, redemption, and the fragile, powerful beauty of human connection. Kale and Alara had survived the night, and though challenges would come, they faced them together, stronger than before. For the first time in centuries, Kale allowed himself to believe that even a creature of darkness could find light, and that light was standing beside him, hand in hand, heart with heart, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring.